They called her shameful. A young mother without a husband, clutching her infant son in the cold northern winds of England, rejected at the very doorstep of her late husband's family. Audrey stood in that windswept square with nothing but dignity and a baby's cries piercing the twilight. Then the Duke of Westmarch stepped from his carriage, a man who had sworn never to feel again after burying his beloved wife. What he offered that evening would scandalize the entire county and change both their lives forever. If this story moves you, please subscribe to keep these tales alive. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from, and leave a like if you believe in second chances at love. Now step into the village of Ravensby, England, in the year 1876, where a cold autumn evening is about to alter two destinies. The wind bit through Audrey's worn travelling cloak as she stood in the cobblestone square of Ravensby, her arms aching from holding 6-month-old Henry against her chest. The baby whimpered, his small fists clutching at her bodice, seeking warmth she could barely provide. Behind her, the door of the modest townhouse remained firmly shut, the echo of her late husband's cousin's words still ringing in her ears. "We have no room for your mistakes, Miss Ashford. That is still your name, is it not? Whatever vows you spoke died with him." Audrey had not corrected the woman. Mrs. Eleanor Finch had made her position clear the moment she saw the baby. No amount of explaining would soften a heart already hardened by propriety and fear of association. The journey from London had cost Audrey nearly every shilling she possessed. She had sold her mother's cameo brooch to pay for third-class passage on the northbound train, clutching Henry through every jolt and stop, believing that family, even distant family, would extend mercy. She had been wrong. The square was emptying as evening descended, shopkeepers pulling down shutters, women hurrying home with baskets tucked under their arms. Audrey felt the weight of their glances, some curious, others dismissive. A young woman alone with an infant and a battered traveling case told a story that needed no words. She straightened her shoulders, refusing to let shame bow her spine. Whatever circumstances had brought her to this moment, she had loved her husband, brief though their marriage had been, and Henry was the living proof of that love. The baby cried louder, a thin wail that cut through the wind. Audrey rocked him gently, murmuring soft reassurances she did not entirely believe herself. Where would they sleep tonight? The inn across the square looked respectable, but she had perhaps enough coin for one night, maybe two if she ate nothing herself. After that, she had no answer. A carriage drew to a halt near the fountain at the square's centre. It was black and polished, drawn by a pair of matched greys, the kind of equipage that announced wealth and station. Audrey barely glanced at it, too consumed with soothing Henry, until she felt the weight of someone's gaze upon her. She looked up. A man had stepped down from the carriage, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark wool that spoke of quality without ostentation. His hair was brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face held the kind of stillness that came from enduring loss. He was perhaps 33, though something in his eyes suggested he had lived more years than his body showed. He stood watching her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment Audrey felt a flicker of fear. Strange men did not often stop to observe women in her position without unpleasant intentions, but he did not approach. He simply stood there, his gaze moving from her face to the baby in her arms, then to the closed door of the Finch house behind her. Understanding flickered across his features. Audrey tightened her hold on Henry and turned slightly, intending to walk toward the inn. She would not be a spectacle. "Sir," a quiet voice from the carriage called. The man turned briefly, exchanged words with his driver, then looked back at Audrey. This time he moved toward her, his steps deliberate but not hurried. She froze, uncertain whether to flee or stand her ground. "Miss," he said when he reached a respectful distance. His voice was low, cultured, the accent of the educated class but without arrogance. "Forgive the intrusion, but I could not help but observe your situation. Do you have lodging for the evening?" Audrey's pride flared. "I am managing, sir." His eyes, a clear grey, held hers steadily. "I do not doubt your capability, but a storm is coming and the inn here has a reputation for turning away women travelling alone, especially those with children." Her breath caught. She had not known that. The innkeeper's wife had looked at her coldly when she passed earlier. The man glanced at the darkening sky, then back at her. "My name is Thomas Ellsworth, Duke of Westmarch. My home, Ravensmere Hall, is 2 miles north of the village. I would offer you and your child shelter for the night, under the supervision of my housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, who maintains the strictest standards of propriety." Audrey stared at him. A duke. She had just been offered refuge by a duke. The absurdity of it mingled with a desperate hope she tried to suppress, but propriety, already frayed by her circumstances, still had claws. "Your Grace, I cannot accept such generosity. It would not be seemly." Seemly. He repeated the word as though tasting its worth. "Miss, I do not know your name or your story, but I know the look of someone who has been turned away from shelter. I also know what it is to value honor. I assure you, my household is run with impeccable discretion. My housekeeper will arrange separate quarters, and you will be free to leave at first light if you wish." Henry wailed again, his small body shivering despite Audrey's best efforts to shield him from the wind. Thomas's gaze softened as he looked at the baby. "Please," he said quietly, "if not for your sake, then for his." The words broke through her resistance. Audrey looked down at her son's red, tear-streaked face and felt her resolve crumble. She could endure cold and hunger, but she could not bear to watch Henry suffer. "Just for one night," she whispered. "Of course." Thomas gestured toward the carriage. "My driver will assist you." As Audrey approached the carriage, cradling Henry close, Thomas spoke again. "May I know your name, miss?" She turned, meeting his eyes. "Audrey, your Grace. Audrey Ashford." He inclined his head. "Mrs. Ashford, you and your son are welcome at Ravensmere." She climbed into the carriage with the driver's help, settling onto the plush seat with Henry nestled against her. Through the window, she watched Thomas speak briefly with his driver before joining them, sitting across from her with careful distance. The carriage jolted forward, leaving the cold square behind. As the village faded into the twilight, Audrey felt the warmth of the enclosed space seep into her bones. Henry quieted his breathing, evening out. Across from her, the Duke of Westmarch sat in silence, his gaze turned toward the window, his profile etched against the dimming light. She did not know what had compelled him to help her. A stranger, a woman society would judge harshly. But as Ravensmere Hall came into view, its windows glowing like warm promises against the gathering storm, Audrey felt something she had not felt in months: hope. Ravensmere Hall rose from the northern landscape like something from a storybook, its stone facade weathered by centuries of coastal winds, yet noble in its endurance. As the carriage rolled up the curved drive, Audrey glimpsed manicured grounds disappearing into darkness, and windows that glowed with the promise of warmth and safety. Henry stirred against her chest, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling, as if sensing the change in their fortune. The Duke descended first, then offered his hand to help Audrey down. His touch was brief, proper, yet she felt the steadiness in his grip, the quiet strength that asked nothing in return for the shelter he provided. "Welcome to Ravensmere, Mrs. Ashford." Before she could respond, the front door opened and a woman appeared at the threshold. She was perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair arranged in a neat coronet and eyes that missed nothing. Her dark dress was impeccable, her posture military in its precision. Yet when she looked at the baby in Audrey's arms, something softened in her expression. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas said, "this is Mrs. Audrey Ashford and her son Henry. They will be our guests. Please prepare the blue room in the East Wing and arrange for a nursemaid to assist with the child's needs." Mrs. Whitmore's gaze moved from Audrey's worn traveling dress to her exhausted face, and Audrey braced herself for judgment. Instead, the housekeeper stepped forward with crisp efficiency. "Of course, Your Grace. Mrs. Ashford, if you will follow me, I will see you settled immediately. The East Wing is quiet and well heated, and we have a cradle that can be brought up from storage." Audrey felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Thank you." Inside, the hall stretched before her in elegant simplicity. No ostentatious gilding or excessive ornament, but rather the quiet wealth of old money and good taste. A fire crackled in the enormous hearth, and the scent of beeswax and lavender hung in the air. Several servants moved with practiced discretion, their curiosity about the unexpected guest evident but controlled. "Mrs. Whitmore led her up a broad staircase, her voice low and businesslike. "There are rules in this house, Mrs. Ashford, and I maintain them for everyone's protection, guest and master alike. You will have your own quarters, separate from His Grace's apartments. Meals may be taken in your room, or if you prefer, in the morning room. A maid will attend you, and we have a trusted nursemaid, Mary, who raised His Grace himself and can help with young Henry if needed." Audrey nodded, relief flooding through her. "I understand, Mrs. Whitmore. I have no wish to cause disruption or scandal." The housekeeper paused at a door painted a soft blue-grey. "Good. His Grace is a man of impeccable honor, Mrs. Ashford, but the world does not always recognize honor when it sees it. We must be vigilant." She opened the door, and Audrey stepped into a room that stole her breath. It was not vast, but it was beautiful in its comfort. A four-poster bed with embroidered hangings dominated one wall, a fire already burning in the grate. Near the window sat a cushioned chair, and beside it a small table with a lamp and a vase of late autumn roses. The walls were papered in a delicate pattern of leaves and birds, and everything spoke of care and attention. Henry whimpered, and Mrs. Whitmore moved with surprising swiftness. "Let me send for Mary and some warm milk. The poor mite must be famished." Within minutes, a kind-faced woman with gentle hands appeared, taking Henry with practiced ease and cooing softly to him. Audrey watched, torn between gratitude and the instinct to keep her son close. "Mary raised 7 children of her own," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. "He is in excellent hands." Audrey forced herself to nod, and as Mary carried Henry to a cushioned settee near the fire, she felt a hand on her arm. Mrs. Whitmore's expression had softened further. "You are safe here, child. His Grace does not extend invitations lightly. Rest, and we will speak more in the morning." After the housekeeper departed, Audrey moved to the fire, watching as Mary fed Henry with a bottle of warm milk and honey water. The baby's eyes began to droop, his small body finally relaxing. Audrey sank into the chair, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood in the doorway, a folded blanket of soft blue wool draped over his arm, and a small wooden cradle carried by a footman behind him. "I thought Henry might need this," he said simply. "It was my son's." The words hung in the air. Audrey had not known the Duke had children. The past tense in his voice told her enough. "Your Grace, I cannot take something of such value." Thomas stepped into the room, his movements careful, respectful of the boundary Mrs. Whitmore had established. He set the blanket on the table beside her chair. "It should be used, Mrs. Ashford. Objects gather meaning from service, not storage." The footman positioned the cradle near the bed, and Mary transferred the now sleeping Henry into it with tender care. The baby looked impossibly small in the carved wood, his dark lashes resting against round cheeks. Thomas looked at the child for a long moment, something indefinable crossing his face. Then he turned to Audrey. "Mrs. Whitmore mentioned you were a governess before your marriage." Audrey straightened. "Yes, Your Grace, I taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and some French and music. The village school could use assistance. The vicar's wife does her best, but there are many children and only her to manage them. If you are willing, I could arrange for you to help. It would give you purpose during your stay, and the children would benefit greatly." Purpose. The word struck something deep within her. She had felt purposeless for so long, adrift in grief and circumstance. "I would be honored, Your Grace." His expression warmed, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. "Thomas. When we are not in company, you may call me Thomas." The intimacy of the offer startled her. "Your Grace, I could not—" He raised a hand gently. "I do not stand on ceremony in my own home, Mrs. Ashford, and I would know your given name as well, if you would grant permission." She met his eyes, those clear grey depths that held both sadness and strength. "Audrey, Audrey." He said it as though testing its shape. "A name that suits you." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something neither could name. The fire crackled. Henry made a small sound in his sleep. Mary moved discreetly toward the door, sensing the moment. "I will leave you to rest," Thomas said finally. "If you need anything, ring for Mrs. Whitmore or Mary. You are under my protection now, and that is not a phrase I use lightly." After he left, Audrey sat in the firelight, the wool blanket soft beneath her fingers. She draped it over Henry's cradle, watching the way it settled around her son like a promise. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Audrey allowed herself to believe that perhaps, the worst was behind them. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, but inside Ravensmere Hall there was only warmth, only shelter, only the quiet beginning of something that felt remarkably like home. And in the corridor beyond, Thomas stood for a moment before returning to his own chambers, the image of a dark-haired woman and a sleeping child already embedded in his thoughts in ways he had not anticipated. Rain drummed against the windows of Ravensmere Hall for 3 days, turning the grounds into a watercolor of grey and green. Audrey found herself settling into a rhythm she had not known since before her husband's death, a routine that felt less like charity and more like belonging. Each morning Mary arrived to help with Henry, her weathered hands gentle as she changed him and coaxed smiles from his small face. Audrey would dress in one of the simple but well-made gowns Mrs. Whitmore had quietly provided, mourning wear that had belonged to the late Duchess, but altered to fit Audrey's smaller frame. She tried not to think too deeply about wearing a dead woman's clothes, tried not to wonder what Charlotte, Duchess of Westmarch, had been like. By mid-morning, when the rain lessened to a drizzle, Audrey would make her way to the village school, a stone building beside the parish church that smelled of chalk and damp wool. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Pemberton, had welcomed her with obvious relief. "Bless you, Mrs. Ashford. I have 32 children ranging from 5 to 14, and only these 2 hands to manage them all." Audrey took to the work with an intensity that surprised even herself. She organized the older children to help the younger ones, created lessons that kept restless minds engaged, and discovered that teaching gave her something she desperately needed, a sense of worth beyond her circumstances. On the 4th day, when pale sunlight finally broke through the clouds, Thomas appeared at the school shortly before noon. Audrey looked up from helping a young girl with her letters to find him standing in the doorway, raindrops still glistening on his coat. The children fell silent, their eyes widening at the sight of the Duke. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said, flustered, rising from her desk. "We are honored. I have brought something," Thomas interrupted gently. He gestured to 2 men behind him carrying wooden crates, books for the children. "And I have arranged for Mr. Davies to repair the roof before winter truly sets in." Mrs. Pemberton pressed a hand to her chest. "Your Grace, this is too generous." Thomas's gaze moved past her to Audrey. "It is an investment in the future. Mrs. Ashford tells me the children here are eager to learn. They should have the tools to do so properly." Audrey felt warmth rise in her cheeks. She had mentioned the school's needs during dinner 2 evenings prior, when Thomas had insisted she join him in the dining room rather than take her meals alone. The conversation had been careful, proper, yet somehow easy. She had not expected him to act on her observations so swiftly. The children swarmed the crates once opened, exclaiming over volumes of poetry, history, and adventure tales. Thomas watched them with something almost like contentment on his usually reserved face. When a small boy tugged at his coat and asked if the Duke would read to them, Thomas glanced at Audrey. "If Mrs. Ashford permits." She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Thomas settled onto a bench far too small for his frame, a copy of Robinson Crusoe in his hands, and began to read. His voice was rich and measured, bringing the story alive, and the children sat transfixed. Audrey stood at the back of the room, watching. There was something profoundly moving about seeing a man of his station sitting among children whose families worked his lands, reading to them as though they were his own. When his eyes lifted from the page and found hers across the room, she felt her breath catch. After the reading, as the children reluctantly returned to their lessons, Thomas approached her. "You have done remarkable work here in just a few days." "The children are remarkable," Audrey replied. "They simply needed someone to see their potential. As do we all." He paused, then added quietly, "I have asked Mrs. Pemberton to ensure everyone in the village knows the improvements came from your recommendations, not my whim." Audrey frowned. "Your Grace, that is not necessary. The credit belongs to you, does it?" His grey eyes held hers steadily. "You saw the need. You articulated it. I merely provided the means. Let the village see you as more than a stranger seeking refuge." Let them see you as someone of value. The words struck deep. She realized then what he was doing, rebuilding her reputation through action, giving her standing in a community that might otherwise judge her harshly. "Thank you," she whispered. Walking back to Ravensmere that afternoon with Henry bundled against her chest and the autumn sun weak but present, Audrey felt something shift inside her. The shame that had weighed on her since her husband's death, since the rejection by his family, began to crack and fall away like old plaster from sound walls. That evening, Thomas found her in the library, a room she had discovered on her second day and claimed as a sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of volumes, and a fire burned perpetually in the massive hearth. She sat curled in a leather chair, Henry asleep in a basket beside her, a book of Wordsworth's poetry open on her lap. He entered quietly, but she sensed his presence before he spoke. "May I join you?" "Of course, Your Grace." "Thomas," he reminded her gently, settling into the chair opposite hers. "When the household sleeps, we need not be so formal." She closed the book, her fingers tracing the gilt lettering on its spine. "I was reading The Prelude. My father loved Wordsworth, as did Charlotte." Thomas's voice softened when he spoke his late wife's name. She could recite entire passages from memory. Audrey hesitated, then asked what she had wondered since arriving. "How long has she been gone?" 3 years. Thomas stared into the fire. "She died bringing our son into the world. He lived only 2 days. The cradle, the blanket." Understanding flooded through Audrey, along with a grief so sharp it made her chest ache. "I am so sorry." They sat in silence, the fire crackling, Henry's soft breathing the only other sound. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice low. "I thought I would never feel anything again except duty. I kept Ravensmere running, managed the estates, fulfilled obligations. But everything was mechanical, distant. Then I saw you in that square, holding your son, refusing to bend even when the world had given you every reason to break. And I felt something wake in me that I thought had died." Audrey's hand trembled as she set the book aside. "Your Grace, Thomas, please. Thomas." His name felt intimate on her tongue. "You saved us that night. You gave us more than shelter. You gave us dignity." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and for the first time since they met, she saw vulnerability in his face. "Perhaps you have given me something as well, Audrey, a reason to be more than a ghost in my own home." Their eyes met and held. The air between them felt charged, fragile as spun glass. Audrey wanted to reach across the space separating them, wanted to touch his hand, wanted things she should not want from a man so far above her station. But she did not move, and neither did he. Some things could not be rushed, no matter how strongly the heart urged otherwise. The library clock chimed 10. Thomas rose, and Audrey stood as well, suddenly aware of propriety, of boundaries that must be maintained. "Sleep well, Audrey." "And you, Thomas." After he left, she gathered Henry and returned to her room, but sleep eluded her for hours. She lay in the darkness, listening to rain begin again against the windows, and thought about a man who had lost everything, yet still had room in his heart to shelter strangers. Tomorrow there would be a charity tea in the village. Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned it that morning, her expression carefully neutral. The ladies of the county would attend, including some who had already begun to whisper about the young widow residing at Ravensmere Hall. Audrey knew what awaited her, but she also knew she would not face it alone, and somehow that made all the difference. The village tea room had been decorated with autumn arrangements, bronze chrysanthemums and burgundy dahlias spilling from porcelain vases. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting patterns across the assembled ladies of Ravensby and the surrounding estates. Audrey entered beside Mrs. Whitmore, acutely aware of the shift in conversation as heads turned. She wore a dress of dove grey with modest black trim, appropriate for a widow, borrowed again from the late Duchess's wardrobe. Mrs. Whitmore had pinned her dark hair in a simple but elegant arrangement, and around her neck hung a small cameo that had been her grandmother's, the only piece of jewelry she had not sold. She held her head high, remembering Thomas's words, "Let them see you as someone of value." Mrs. Pemberton greeted them warmly, drawing Audrey into a circle of women discussing the school improvements. For a few moments, the conversation flowed easily, talk of primers and slates and the children's progress. Then Lady Vivian Harbury arrived. She swept into the room like winter itself, beautiful in a nice blue gown that matched her eyes and showed wealth in every stitch. Widowed young like Audrey, but under vastly different circumstances, Vivian had retained her late husband's fortune and title. She was 29, poised and utterly secure in her position. She was also, Audrey had learned from village gossip, determined to become the next Duchess of Westmarch. "Mrs. Ashford," Vivian said, her voice carrying across the room with calculated precision. "How delightful that you could join us. I understand you are a guest at Ravensmere Hall." The emphasis on guest was deliberate. Audrey set down her teacup with steady hands. "Yes, Lady Harbury. His Grace has been most generous." Generous indeed. Vivian smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. The Duke has always had such a charitable nature. Why, just last winter, he took in an entire family displaced by fire. Of course, they stayed in the groundskeeper's cottage, not the main house. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Several ladies exchanged glances. Audrey felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "His Grace is a man of principle and compassion. I am grateful for his kindness." Vivian selected a biscuit from the tiered tray with languid grace. Kindness can be such a dangerous word, can it not? So easily misunderstood by those unfamiliar with proper society. Young women alone with infants sometimes confuse charity with other opportunities. The room fell silent. Even the clink of spoons against china ceased. Audrey felt every eye upon her, felt the judgment, the speculation. Her hands trembled in her lap, but she forced herself to meet Vivian's cold gaze. "I confuse nothing, Lady Harbury. I know precisely what I am, a mother doing her best to provide for her son. His Grace saw someone in need and offered shelter with complete propriety. If you find fault in that, perhaps the fault lies not in the charity but in the observer." Before Vivian could respond, the door opened and Thomas entered, looking slightly windblown and entirely out of place among the delicate cups and feminine company. His gaze found Audrey immediately, took in the tension in the room, the defensive set of her shoulders. "Ladies," he said, nodding to the assembly. "Mrs. Pemberton, forgive the intrusion. I came to see how the new books are being received." Mrs. Pemberton looked flustered but pleased. "Wonderfully, Your Grace. Thanks to Mrs. Ashford's excellent organizational skills, we have implemented a lending system for the older students." Thomas moved further into the room, his presence commanding despite his quiet manner. He stopped near Audrey's chair, a position that aligned him unmistakably at her side. "Mrs. Ashford's contributions to our village school have been invaluable. She has shown dedication and skill that far exceeds what I had hoped. The children are thriving under her instruction, and several parents have remarked on their improved literacy. I consider myself fortunate that circumstances brought such a talented educator to Ravensby." He spoke clearly, ensuring every woman present heard each word. It was a public endorsement, a declaration of support that could not be misinterpreted. Vivian's expression hardened. "How lovely," she said tightly, though one wonders if a more permanent arrangement might not be more suitable. "Surely Mrs. Ashford would prefer her own establishment rather than imposing on your hospitality indefinitely." Thomas's grey eyes turned to ice. "Mrs. Ashford is not an imposition, Lady Harbury. She is a valued member of my household and will remain at Ravensmere as long as she wishes. I trust that is clear." The words fell like stones into still water. Vivian's face flushed, but she recovered quickly, her smile brittle. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense. I simply thought of Mrs. Ashford's reputation. You know how people talk." "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "I do know. And I find that those who speak most freely about others' reputations often have the least regard for truth or compassion." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Vivian stiffened, set down her cup with a sharp clink, and excused herself with forced politeness. Several of her closer associates followed, leaving the room in a rustle of silk and barely concealed whispers. After they departed, the atmosphere lightened considerably. Mrs. Pemberton poured fresh tea with shaking hands, and conversation resumed, carefully avoiding the confrontation they had witnessed. Thomas remained for another quarter hour, discussing the school repairs with genuine interest before taking his leave. As he reached the door, he glanced back at Audrey. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, something passed between them that needed no words. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition, connection, the knowledge that they had stood together against judgment and emerged stronger. When Audrey and Mrs. Whitmore returned to Ravensmere that afternoon, they found Thomas waiting in the library. He stood as they entered, his expression serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you give us a moment?" The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, closing the door behind her, but remaining, Audrey knew, just beyond it. Propriety must still be maintained. Thomas approached slowly. "I apologize if my presence at the tea caused you discomfort." Audrey shook her head. "You defended me when you had no obligation to do so. I am in your debt. You are in no one's debt." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. Then he moved to the shelf behind his desk and removed a slim volume. When he returned, he held it out to her. "I thought you might enjoy this." It was a collection of Wordsworth's shorter poems, bound in soft brown leather with gold edging. Audrey took it, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. The touch lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary, and she felt warmth bloom where their skin met. "There is a silk ribbon marking my favorite," he said quietly. "I would be interested in your thoughts." She opened the book carefully, the ribbon marked "Surprised by Joy." Her throat tightened as she read the opening lines, understanding immediately why he had chosen it. A poem about unexpected moments of happiness piercing through grief, about the guilt of feeling joy after loss. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Yes." His voice was low, intimate. "It is." They stood close now, closer than propriety strictly allowed. Audrey could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and autumn air that clung to him. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then lifted quickly back to her eyes. She saw desire there, carefully controlled but unmistakable, and felt an answering heat rise within her own body. "Audrey." He breathed her name like a question, like a prayer. She swayed toward him, drawn by something stronger than reason. His hand lifted, trembling slightly, and his fingers grazed her cheek so gently she might have imagined it. Her eyes fluttered closed at the contact, her breath catching. Then footsteps sounded in the hall, and they sprang apart. Mrs. Whitmore knocked and entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Pardon, Your Grace, but Henry is fussing for his mother." Audrey clutched the book to her chest, her heart racing. "Of course. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." She fled the library without looking back, but she felt Thomas's gaze following her, felt the weight of what had almost happened hovering in the air, like heat before a storm. That night, alone in her room with Henry sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Audrey pressed the book to her lips and allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding for days. She was falling in love with the Duke of Westmarch, and God help her, she believed he might be falling too. The fever came without warning on a Tuesday evening, just as autumn surrendered fully to winter's advance. Audrey had put Henry down for the night, kissed his warm forehead, and retired to read by the fire. An hour later, his cries woke her from a light doze, but these were not his usual complaints of hunger or discomfort. These cries were thin and desperate, the sound of suffering. She rushed to his cradle and lifted him, her heart lurching at the heat radiating from his small body. His cheeks were flushed scarlet, his eyes glassy and unfocused. She had seen fever before, had lost friends to illnesses that began just like this, and terror seized her throat. "Mrs. Whitmore." She yanked the bell pull hard, once, twice, 3 times. Within minutes, the housekeeper appeared in her dressing gown, took one look at Henry and moved into action. "I will send for Dr. Harrison immediately. Keep him cool but not cold, and try to get him to take water." Audrey nodded, already moving to the wash basin, dampening cloths with trembling hands. She laid Henry on the bed and began sponging his burning skin, murmuring reassurances she did not believe herself. He whimpered and turned his face away, too weak even to cry properly now. Time became elastic, stretching and contracting in strange ways. She did not know how long she worked over her son before she heard quick footsteps in the corridor, and Thomas burst through the door, coat thrown hastily over his shirt, hair disheveled from sleep. "The doctor is coming," he said. "What can I do?" "Pray," Audrey whispered, her voice breaking. "Just pray he survives this night." Thomas did not leave. He sent a footman for more water, more cloths, more blankets. He lit every lamp in the room to banish the shadows that seemed to press too close. When Dr. Harrison arrived 20 minutes later, grey-haired and competent, Thomas stood back but remained present, his face carved from stone. The doctor examined Henry with careful thoroughness, listening to his chest, checking his throat, feeling the glands in his neck. Finally, he straightened. "It is a fever, certainly, but I see no signs of scarlet fever or diphtheria. His lungs are clear. Keep him cool, forced liquids if you can, and watch him closely through the night. If he worsens, send for me immediately." After the doctor left, promising to return at dawn, Audrey settled into the chair beside the bed with Henry cradled against her chest. Thomas pulled another chair close and sat, his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving the baby. "You should rest, Your Grace." "Thomas," he corrected her automatically, "and no, I will not rest. Not tonight." The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. Audrey sponged Henry's skin again and again, managed to coax a few drops of water between his lips, rocked him when he whimpered. Thomas refreshed the water, brought fresh cloths, added wood to the fire when the room grew cold. They worked in silent partnership, a strange intimacy born of shared purpose and fear. Around 2 in the morning, Henry's fever broke. The flush faded from his cheeks, his breathing eased, and he fell into genuine sleep rather than feverish restlessness. Audrey pressed her face to his hair and wept quietly, her body shaking with relief so intense it was painful. Thomas moved without thinking, kneeling beside her chair and wrapping his arms around both mother and child. She turned into his embrace, clutching Henry between them, and let herself be held while the terror drained away. His hand cupped the back of her head, his fingers threading through her unbound hair, and he murmured words she could not quite hear, but felt in her bones. When she finally lifted her face, they were so close she could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes, could feel his breath against her damp cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for staying. Did you think I would not?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Audrey, did you truly think I could leave you to face this alone?" She had no answer. She only knew that having him here had made the unbearable bearable, that his presence had been the only thing keeping her from shattering completely. They moved Henry back to his cradle together, tucking the blue blanket around him. Then they sank into opposite chairs, suddenly aware of how exhausted they were, how the adrenaline had masked their fatigue. The fire burned low. The house was utterly silent around them. "I lost them both in a single week," Thomas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Charlotte died on a Monday. Our son, James, died the following Sunday. I held him as he took his last breath, and I have never felt so powerless in my life." Audrey's throat ached. "I am so sorry. I thought grief would destroy me. For months, I went through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. I ran the estates, I fulfilled my duties, but inside I was hollow." He looked at her directly. "Then I saw you in that square, holding Henry, refusing to break despite everything the world had thrown at you. And something in that hollowness shifted. You made me want to feel again, even though feeling meant risking pain." Audrey reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, holding tight. "My husband died 3 months after we married," she said quietly. "A riding accident, sudden and senseless. His family blamed me, said I distracted him, made him reckless. They wanted nothing to do with the child I carried. I have been alone since Henry was born, carrying shame I did not earn, judged for circumstances beyond my control." "You are not alone anymore," Thomas said fiercely. "I swear to you, Audrey, you are not alone." Their hands remained clasped as dawn began to grey the windows. They spoke of loss and loneliness, of the weight of expectations and the cruelty of society. They spoke of small joys rediscovered, of moments when beauty broke through sorrow unexpectedly. Thomas told her about Charlotte's laugh, about James's perfect tiny fingers. Audrey told him about teaching her first class, about the moment she realized she was pregnant and felt both terror and wonder. The conversation wandered and circled back, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with truth. By the time true daylight filled the room, they knew each other in ways that went deeper than any physical touch could reach. Henry stirred and made a small sound. Audrey rose to check him, and relief flooded her when she found his forehead cool, his eyes tracking her face with normal alertness. She lifted him, kissing his cheeks, laughing through fresh tears. "He is well," she breathed. "Thomas, he is well." Thomas stood and crossed to her, looking down at the baby with such tenderness that Audrey's heart squeezed. Henry reached up and grasped Thomas's finger, holding tight with surprising strength. "Strong lad," Thomas murmured. "He gets that from his mother." Their eyes met over Henry's head. Thomas lifted his free hand and tucked a strand of hair behind Audrey's ear, his touch lingering at her temple. She leaned into his palm, her eyes closing briefly at the comfort of human contact, of his contact specifically. "The winter ball is in 3 days," he said softly. "Will you come? As your guest? As my partner?" He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "The first dance is traditionally given to the lady the host wishes to honor above all others. I would like to give it to you, if you will accept." Audrey's breath caught. Such a gesture would announce to everyone in the county that she held a special place in his regard. It would fuel every rumor, validate every speculation. It would also be the most wonderful thing anyone had ever offered her. "Yes," she whispered, "I accept." Thomas smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face into something warm and almost boyish. He squeezed her hand once more before stepping back, propriety reasserting itself with the arrival of full morning. "Rest now. I will have Mrs. Whitmore send Mary to watch Henry." After he left, Audrey sat in the chair he had occupied through the long night and felt the shape of the future shifting around her. Whatever came next, whatever scandal or judgment awaited, she would face it beside a man who had held vigil with her through darkness and stayed to see the dawn. She pressed her fingers to her lips, remembering the warmth of his hand, the sound of his voice speaking truths in the shadowed hours. 3 days until the ball. 3 days until she would stand beside him in public and let the world see what her heart already knew. She was falling, had fallen, and there was no safety net below her except the hope that he would catch her when she landed. The great hall of Ravensmere had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across polished floors, and garlands of winter greenery draped the columns. Musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above, while servants moved with practiced precision, arranging refreshment tables laden with delicacies. Audrey stood at the top of the main staircase, her hands trembling as she smoothed the skirt of her gown. Mrs. Whitmore had worked a miracle. The dress had belonged to Charlotte, but had been altered so extensively it felt like something new, something made just for Audrey. Pale blue silk caught the light like water. The bodice fitted perfectly to her figure, the neckline modest but elegant. Her dark hair had been arranged in an intricate style with small pearl pins, and around her throat she wore a simple ribbon with a silver pendant Thomas had sent to her room that afternoon with a note, "To match your courage." Henry was safe with Mary in the nursery, well recovered and cheerful. Dr. Harrison had pronounced him completely healthy that morning, and Audrey had finally allowed herself to breathe fully again. Now, looking down at the assembling guests, she felt her courage waver. They were all there, the county families, the neighboring gentry, the wealthy merchants who had bought their way into society, and Vivian Harbury, resplendent in crimson silk that made her look like a beautiful wound, her eyes scanning the room with predatory interest. "You look lovely," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly beside her. "His Grace will be honored to have you on his arm." Audrey descended the stairs slowly, aware of heads turning, of whispers following her progress. She held her head high, remembering everything Thomas had told her about her worth, about belonging. At the bottom of the stairs, he waited. Thomas wore formal black with a silver waistcoat, his cravat tied perfectly, his dark hair brushed back to reveal the strong lines of his face. But it was his eyes that held her, those grey depths warming as he watched her approach. When she reached him, he bowed and offered his hand. "Mrs. Ashford, you honor my home with your presence." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The honor is entirely mine." His fingers closed around hers, and she felt his thumb brush across her knuckles in a gesture so subtle no one else would notice. But she felt it like a brand, like a promise. The evening progressed with careful formality. Thomas introduced her to various guests, always at his side, always making clear through his manner that she was under his protection. Some received her warmly. Others offered polite coldness. Vivian watched from across the room, her smile sharp as broken glass. When the music began, Thomas turned to Audrey. "The first waltz is traditionally reserved for the lady of the house. Tonight, that is you." The declaration silenced nearby conversations. Audrey felt the weight of expectation, of scandal brewing, but Thomas simply led her onto the floor as though there was nothing unusual about a duke dancing with a widow of no fortune or family. His hand settled at her waist, firm and warm through the silk of her gown. Her hand rested on his shoulder, and their other hands clasped as the music swelled. They began to move. Audrey had learned to dance as a governess, teaching the steps to her charges, but she had never waltzed like this. Thomas led with effortless grace, spinning her through the patterns as though they had danced together 1,000 times. The room blurred around them. She was aware only of his hand guiding her, his eyes holding hers, the way their bodies moved in perfect synchronization. "You are trembling," he murmured. "I am terrified," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of this, of feeling too much, of wanting things I should not want." His hand tightened at her waist, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "What if I want those same things?" Her breath caught. The music soared. They turned and turned, lost in a moment that felt suspended from time, from judgment, from everything except the two of them, and the connection that hummed between them like a plucked string. Then the music ended, and reality crashed back. Applause rippled through the room, but underneath it ran currents of speculation and disapproval. Thomas led her from the floor, and Vivian intercepted them near the refreshment table. "How touching," she said, her voice carrying. "The Duke dancing with his charity case. Tell me, Mrs. Ashford, did you practice that performance? You have certainly captured his attention most thoroughly." "Lady Harbury," Thomas said, his voice cold as winter steel, "you forget yourself." "Do I?" Vivian's eyes glittered. "Or am I simply the only one willing to speak truth? Everyone here knows what she is. A woman alone with a bastard child, attaching herself to your household like—" "Thomas," Audrey said quickly, touching his arm. She felt him vibrating with suppressed fury. "Do not." But others had heard. The whispers grew louder. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the scent of scandal. Vivian smiled triumphantly. "It is only a matter of time before the entire county knows you are being manipulated by a woman, trading on your grief and loneliness. She seeks security for herself and her child, and you are too blinded by misplaced compassion to see it." The words struck like physical blows. Audrey felt shame rise hot in her cheeks, felt the old familiar weight of judgment crushing down on her. She wanted to flee, to disappear, to never have come to this ball or this house or this village. Then Thomas spoke, and his voice cut through the room like a blade. "You will apologize to Mrs. Ashford immediately, or you will leave my home and never return." Vivian laughed, but there was an edge of desperation in it. "Really, Thomas, you cannot be serious. I am trying to protect you from what? From a woman of intelligence and grace? From someone who has shown more courage in a month than you have shown in your entire life?" He stepped forward, placing himself between Audrey and Vivian. "Mrs. Ashford is a guest in my home, and she will be treated with respect. If you cannot manage that basic courtesy, then you are no longer welcome here." The room had gone utterly silent. Even the musicians had stopped. Vivian's face cycled through shock, fury, and finally calculation. She dipped into a stiff curtsy. "My apologies, Your Grace." I spoke in haste. "Not to me," Thomas said quietly. "To her." Vivian turned to Audrey, her eyes burning with hatred barely masked by civility. "Forgive me, Mrs. Ashford, I misspoke. It was not a real apology and everyone knew it. But it was a public retreat, a loss of face that Vivian would not soon forgive." She swept from the room with her closest associates trailing behind her, like the train of a gown. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming with artificial brightness. Thomas turned to Audrey, his expression softening immediately. "Are you well?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to be strong, but the confrontation had shaken her. "I need air." He guided her through the crowd and out onto the terrace. Snow had begun to fall, large flakes drifting down like pieces of torn paper. The cold hit her face, bracing and clean. She breathed deeply, trying to calm the racing of her heart. "I am sorry," she said. "I have brought scandal to your door. You have brought nothing but light." Thomas stood close behind her, not touching but present, solid. Vivian spoke from bitterness and thwarted ambition. Her words mean nothing. They mean everything to people like her. Audrey turned to face him. "Thomas, she will spread rumors throughout the county. She will make certain everyone knows I am here living under your roof. Your reputation will survive, as will yours." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm against her cold cheeks. "I told you once that you are under my protection. Did you think I spoke idly?" She looked up at him. This man who had defended her publicly, who had stayed through Henry's illness, who danced with her as though she was someone worthy of honoring. Snow caught in his hair melted on his shoulders. The sounds of the ball continued inside, but out here there was only the whisper of falling snow and the pounding of her heart. "I do not know what I think anymore," she whispered. "I only know that being near you feels like the only right thing in a world that has felt wrong for so long. Audrey." He said her name like a benediction, like a question, like the beginning of something that could not be taken back. Inside, someone called his name. Duty intruded, as it always would. But Thomas did not immediately pull away. He stood there, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers as snow continued to fall around them. "This is not finished," he said finally. "Between us, this is not finished." Then he stepped back, the cold rushing in where his warmth had been. He offered his arm and she took it, and together they returned to the bright, judgmental world of the ballroom. But something had shifted. Something had been acknowledged that could not be unspoken. As the evening wore on, as more snow began to accumulate outside and guests murmured about perhaps staying the night rather than risk the roads, Audrey felt anticipation coiling in her belly. The night was young and Ravensmere Hall was large and full of quiet corners where truth could be spoken and boundaries could blur. She caught Thomas's eye across the crowded room, and the heat in his gaze made her breath stutter. "Not finished," he had said. No, she thought, not finished at all. The snow fell heavier as the night deepened, transforming Ravensmere's grounds into a hushed white landscape. Inside, guests murmured about impassable roads and accepted Thomas's offer of accommodation with varying degrees of graciousness. Servants rushed to prepare chambers, while Mrs. Whitmore orchestrated the chaos with military efficiency. Audrey slipped away from the crowded drawing room where ladies clustered near the fire, their voices sharp with speculation. She needed quiet, needed space to breathe after the confrontation with Vivian. Her feet carried her through familiar corridors until she found herself in the portrait gallery. A long room lined with paintings of Ellsworth ancestors stretching back centuries. Only one fire burned here, in the massive hearth at the room's center, casting dancing shadows across stern faces and elaborate frames. The windows showed nothing but swirling white beyond the glass. She walked slowly along the gallery, studying the portraits, trying to see Thomas in the faces of his forebears. She found him in a portrait near the end, a younger Thomas, perhaps 25, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. Charlotte. They looked happy, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, her smile radiant. Audrey felt a pang of something she could not quite name. Not jealousy, but perhaps wistfulness for the certainty they had shared, the security of their love. She was beautiful, a voice said behind her. Audrey turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, his cravat loosened, his coat discarded somewhere. He looked tired but more relaxed than he had all evening, as though shedding the formal trappings of his position had freed something in him. "She was," Audrey agreed quietly. "You look happy in this portrait." Thomas approached slowly, his eyes on the painting. "I was." Charlotte made happiness feel simple, uncomplicated. We grew up together, knew we would marry from childhood. There were no surprises, no uncertainties. "And now," Audrey asked softly, He turned to look at her directly. Now I have learned that certainty and happiness are not the same thing, and that perhaps the surprises, the uncertainties are what make us feel most alive. The fire crackled. Outside, wind drove snow against the windows. They stood close enough that Audrey could see the pulse beating at his throat, could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and winter air that clung to him. "I should not be alone with you like this," she said, but made no move to leave. "No," he agreed. "You should not." Neither moved. The space between them hummed with possibility, with desire held in check by the thinnest thread of propriety. "Audrey." Thomas took a half step closer. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Anything." His grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "May I court you?" "Properly, openly, with the intention of marriage if you will have me." "I know the obstacles. I know society will judge us, will say I am acting rashly or that you are mercenary. I know my position makes this complicated in ways that would be simpler for other men, but I need you to know that I am asking not from pity or obligation, but because I have not felt this alive since Charlotte died, and I do not want to lose this feeling. I do not want to lose you." The words fell between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Audrey thought she knew about her future. She searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, and found none. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know you better than you think. I know you faced rejection with dignity. I know you love your son with a fierceness that makes you stand tall when the world tries to bow you down. I know you are intelligent and kind and capable of joy despite everything you have endured." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "And I know that when I am near you, I feel hope again. Tell me that is not enough to build something real upon." Tears pricked Audrey's eyes. "What of Henry? Society will never accept. I will raise him as my own. He will have my name if you consent to marry me, my protection, my love. Any child of yours is a child I will cherish." The promise broke something open inside her. She swayed forward and Thomas caught her hands in his, their fingers intertwining. His thumbs traced circles on her palms, a touch so intimate it sent heat pooling low in her belly. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of wanting this too much. Afraid of what happens if it is taken away. Then we will be afraid together." Thomas lifted one of her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "But we will also be brave together. Say yes, Audrey. Say you will let me try to make you happy, yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Yes, Thomas, I will." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, the emotion there was almost too much to bear. "May I kiss you?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Please." Thomas released one of her hands, but kept the other clasped in his. His free hand rose to cup her face, his palm warm against her cheek. He moved slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not want to pull away. She wanted this, had wanted it since that first moment in the library when their fingers had brushed over Wordsworth's poems. When his lips met hers, it was soft at first, questioning. She answered by pressing closer, her free hand rising to rest against his chest, where she could feel his heart racing as fast as her own. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and searching. His hand slid from her cheek into her hair, pins scattering as he tilted her head back to taste her more thoroughly. Audrey made a small sound in her throat, surprise and pleasure mingling. She had been kissed before by her late husband, but never like this. Never with this intensity, this barely controlled need. Thomas's arm came around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she felt the hard planes of his body through the layers of silk and linen separating them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. Their hands remained clasped between their bodies. "We should stop," he said, his voice rough. "We should," she agreed, but neither moved. "If we do not stop, I will not want to let you go. And there are still guests in this house, so still propriety to maintain." Audrey pulled back just enough to look at him. His hair was disheveled from her fingers, his eyes dark with desire, his lips slightly swollen from kissing her. He looked undone in a way that made her feel powerful and terrified in equal measure. "Tomorrow," she said. "We can talk tomorrow about how to proceed, about when to announce our intentions." "Tomorrow," he agreed, but still they did not move apart. Thomas's hand came up again to cradle her face, his thumb brushing across her lower lip. She shivered at the touch. "You are so beautiful," he murmured. "I have wanted to tell you that since the first moment I saw you in that square, holding Henry and refusing to break. I wanted to tell you that you have kind eyes," she replied. "That when you looked at me, I did not feel judged. I felt seen. You are seen, Audrey. Every part of you." He kissed her again, slower this time but no less affecting. His lips traced the corner of her mouth, her jaw, the sensitive spot just below her ear that made her gasp. She felt his smile against her skin before he pulled away completely, putting proper distance between them with visible effort. "Go," he said gently. "Before I forget, I am a gentleman." Audrey laughed shakily and pressed her hand to her racing heart. She moved toward the door but paused at the threshold to look back. Thomas stood silhouetted against the fire, watching her with an expression that promised this was only the beginning. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, my love." The endearment sent warmth cascading through her. She fled before she could do something foolish like return to his arms. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the wall and tried to calm her breathing. Her lips felt swollen, her body humming with unfulfilled desire. She had agreed to marry him. He had called her his love. Everything had changed. She made her way back to her chambers, grateful that most guests had already retired. In her room she found Henry sleeping peacefully, and Mary dozing in a chair beside the cradle. Audrey dismissed the nursemaid gently and prepared for bed, but sleep felt impossible. She stood at her window, watching snow continue to fall, and touched her fingers to her lips where Thomas's kiss still burned. Tomorrow they would announce their courtship. Society would erupt in scandal and speculation. Vivian would rage. But tonight, in this snow-hushed house, Audrey allowed herself to believe in happy endings. She was going to marry the Duke of Westmarch. And against all odds, against all expectations, it was not duty or convenience that drew them together. It was love, simple and complicated and utterly real. The snow fell heavier still, a white curtain drawn across the world, and Audrey smiled into the darkness, hope blooming in her chest, like spring flowers breaking through winter frost. The blizzard raged through the night, wind howling around Ravensmere's stone walls like something alive and hungry. By morning, the snow had piled in drifts high as a man's chest, and the world beyond the windows looked erased, redrawn in white. The trapped guests complained politely over breakfast about the inconvenience, though most seemed secretly pleased to have an excuse to linger in such comfortable surroundings. Audrey moved through the day in a daze of anticipation. Thomas caught her eye across the breakfast room, and the heat in his gaze made her cheeks flush. They had agreed to announce their courtship once the guests departed, but the snow showed no signs of relenting. Mrs. Whitmore had organized entertainments to occupy everyone: card games in the drawing room, billiards for the gentlemen, needlework for the ladies. Audrey retreated to Henry whenever possible, using her son as both anchor and excuse. But as evening approached and the house settled into another night of enforced hospitality, she found herself restless in a way she could not quite name. It was more than desire, though desire certainly thrummed through her veins. It was the need to be near Thomas, to continue what they had begun in the gallery. After Henry fell asleep and Mary took her post in the adjoining room, Audrey stood at her window watching snow continue to fall. The clock struck 10. The house grew quieter as guests retired. She should sleep. Instead, she found herself pulling a shawl over her nightdress and stepping into the corridor. She did not plan where her feet would take her, but they knew. Down the familiar hallways, past sleeping chambers, toward the library where lamplight showed beneath the door. She knocked softly. "Come in." Thomas stood near the fire, still dressed, though his coat was discarded, and his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He held a book but set it aside immediately when he saw her. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "I know. If someone sees you, your reputation, let them see." Audrey stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The soft click of the latch sounded loud in the quiet. "I'm tired of living in fear of what others think. I'm tired of denying what I feel." Thomas crossed to her in 3 long strides. "Audrey, we agreed to wait. To do this properly. We agreed to wait for an announcement." She looked up at him, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "But I do not want to wait for this. For us." His jaw tightened. "You do not know what you are asking." "Yes, I do." She reached up and touched his face, her palm against the rough stubble on his jaw. "I am asking you to stop being so honorable for one night. I am asking you to let me choose this, choose you, without society's approval or the church's blessing. I am asking you to trust that I know my own heart." Audrey. Her name on his lips sounded like surrender. "Are you certain? More certain than I have been of anything." He turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, his eyes closing briefly. When he opened them again, the restraint that had governed him crumbled. He cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with an intensity that stole her breath. She melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest to curl into his shirt. They moved without conscious decision toward the settee near the fire. Thomas broke the kiss only to ask again, his voice rough, "Are you sure? We can stop. We can wait. Tell me now if you want me to stop." "Do not stop," she breathed. "Please, Thomas, do not stop." He groaned and claimed her mouth again, deeper this time, his tongue sliding against hers in a way that made heat pool low in her belly. His hands moved from her face to her shoulders, sliding the shawl away so it puddled on the floor. Through the thin fabric of her nightdress, she felt the warmth of his palms, the controlled strength in his fingers. Thomas lowered her gently onto the settee, following her down, his body covering hers, but careful not to crush her with his weight. He kissed her throat, the hollow at the base where her pulse hammered, the edge of her collarbone. Each touch of his lips sent sparks racing across her skin. "You are so soft," he murmured against her neck. "So perfect." Her hands found the buttons of his shirt and fumbled with them until he pulled back slightly and helped her, shrugging out of the garment so she could finally touch the bare skin of his chest. He was warm and solid, and when she ran her palms over the planes of muscle, he shuddered. "Your turn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I?" She nodded, and he slowly, reverently, loosened the ribbons at the neck of her nightdress. His fingers brushed against her skin as he worked, each touch deliberate, worshipful. When he eased the fabric down over her shoulders, bearing her to his gaze, she fought the instinct to cover herself. "Beautiful," he breathed. "You are so beautiful, Audrey." He kissed her shoulder, then lower, his mouth warm against her skin. She gasped and arched into him, her fingers threading through his hair. The sensation was overwhelming, pleasure mixed with vulnerability, desire tangled with trust. She had never felt so exposed, so seen, and yet she had never felt safer. They moved together slowly, learning each other's bodies, discovering what touches brought gasps, what kisses made them both tremble. Thomas was patient, careful, always watching her face to ensure she felt pleasure, not pain. When he finally joined their bodies, they both stilled, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. "All right?" he asked, his voice strained with the effort of control. "Yes, more than all right." They moved in ancient rhythm, slow at first, then building, their breathing synchronizing as pleasure built between them like a gathering storm. Audrey clung to him, her face buried in his neck, overwhelmed by sensation and emotion. This was not just physical. This was communion, connection, the merging of two souls who had been lonely too long. When release came, it crashed over them both, leaving them gasping and trembling in each other's arms. Thomas gathered her close, pulling a blanket from the back of the settee to cover them both. They lay tangled together before the fire, skin against skin, hearts gradually slowing to match each other's pace. "I love you," Thomas said quietly, his lips against her hair. "I should have said it before, but I am saying it now. I love you, Audrey." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were not sad tears. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first night when you offered shelter without judgment." They stayed like that for a long time, speaking in whispers, sharing secrets and promises and dreams for a future that suddenly seemed possible. Eventually, Thomas stirred. "You should return to your room before the house wakes. Let me stay a little longer." "Please." He tightened his arms around her. A little longer then, but a little longer stretched into hours. They dozed fitfully, waking to touch and whisper and kiss, unable to bear separation even for sleep. The fire burned low, and Thomas added wood, returning to gather Audrey into his warmth. When pale dawn light finally began to show through the windows, they dressed slowly, helping each other with buttons and ties, hands lingering, stealing final kisses. Thomas walked her to the door and pulled her into his arms one last time. "Tonight I will speak with Mrs. Whitmore about announcing our engagement the moment the guests depart. No more waiting, no more hiding. I want the world to know you are mine." "And you are mine," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. "Always." Audrey slipped through the quiet corridors back to her chamber, her body pleasantly sore, her heart full to bursting. She checked on Henry, found him still sleeping peacefully, and crawled into her own bed as the house began to wake around her. Everything had changed. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and she felt no regret, only peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever scandal their union might provoke, they would face it together. She pressed her hand to her heart and smiled into the pale morning light, knowing that somewhere in this vast house Thomas was doing the same. They belonged to each other now in body and soul, and no force on earth could undo what had been forged in firelight and snow. The snow melted by midday, roads clearing enough for trapped guests to depart. Audrey watched from the morning room as carriages rolled away, their occupants already composing letters filled with speculation. Vivian left last, her face a mask of cold fury as she swept past Thomas without farewell. An hour later, Thomas found Audrey with a folded paper in hand, his expression grim. It arrived from York this morning. Vivian wasted no time. Audrey took the paper and read the society column, words burning as her eyes moved across them. The esteemed Duke of W has taken a most unusual house guest. Mrs. A young widow of questionable background with an infant son, resides in the ducal household under circumstances that defy propriety. One must wonder what services she provides to warrant such extraordinary accommodation. The paper crumpled in her fist. "I will leave immediately. I will not let this destroy your reputation." "No." Thomas gripped her shoulders firmly. "This is exactly what Vivian wants. We will not give her that satisfaction. Thomas, this will spread. Every drawing room in the north will discuss this. Your position. My position is secure because I am a duke." He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I told you I would protect you. Did you think I spoke empty words? We will marry within the month. Once you are my duchess, let anyone dare speak against you." Before she could respond, Mrs. Whitmore appeared, troubled. "Your Grace, Vicar Pemberton and the parish council are here requesting an audience." In the study, 5 men waited, faces ranging from uncomfortable to hostile. The vicar looked pained as he spoke. "Your Grace, the parish is concerned. Mrs. Ashford is an unmarried woman in your home without proper chaperonage. Parents are questioning whether she should continue teaching their children." Thomas remained utterly calm. What would satisfy the parish council's concerns? "Mr." Blackwood spoke harshly. "Mrs. Ashford should be removed from the school and this house. Her presence is inappropriate." "Gentlemen." Thomas's voice cut like a blade. "Let me be absolutely clear. Mrs. Ashford is the woman I intend to marry. We will wed within the month. Does that satisfy your concerns about propriety?" Stunned silence. The vicar's eyes widened. "Marriage? Your Grace, this is rather sudden. I am a widower of 3 years. I wish to marry again. Is there any impediment?" "No, Your Grace, but then I fail to see the problem." Thomas moved beside Audrey, taking her hand. "Mrs. Ashford will soon be the Duchess of Westmarch. Her son will be raised as my own, with all rights that entails. I expect the parish to welcome her with the respect due to her position." The vicar recovered, his kind nature reasserting itself. "Of course, Your Grace. Please accept our congratulations." But Blackwood persisted. "The boy is not yours, Your Grace. He is a bastard. Surely you cannot mean to give him your name." The temperature dropped. Thomas took one step toward Blackwood, and the man stepped back involuntarily. "Henry is an innocent child who has committed no sin. He will bear my name, because I choose to give it to him. If you or anyone else speaks against him or his mother again, you will find yourself explaining your prejudice to someone far less patient." The men departed subdued. When the door closed, Audrey sank into a chair. Thomas knelt before her, taking both hands. "This will not be easy, there will be more confrontations. But I meant every word. You will be my Duchess, and Henry will be my son." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You would defy all of society for us? I would defy the world." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "Audrey, do you trust me? With my life? Then trust me in this. We will stand before God and the parish in 4 weeks. We will speak our vows, and after that, nothing anyone says will matter." He pulled her close. "I want you as my wife. I want Henry as my son. I want us to be a family." "So do I," she whispered, "more than anything." That evening, Thomas sent an announcement to York. "The Duke of Westmarch is pleased to announce his engagement to Mrs. Audrey Ashford. The wedding will take place at Ravensmere Hall Chapel on the 15th of December. The Duke wishes it known that he will raise Mrs. Ashford's son, Henry, as his own." When it appeared 3 days later, reactions were mixed. Some congratulated Thomas. Others whispered about unseemly haste. Vivian took to her bed for a week, but Thomas and Audrey paid no attention. They had 4 weeks to prepare. Thomas procured a special license. He commissioned a ring, gold with a single sapphire the color of her eyes. Mrs. Whitmore organized with martial efficiency. Every evening after Henry slept and the house quieted, they met in the library. They sat close, hands entwined, speaking of their future. Sometimes they kissed, and those kisses grew heated enough that Thomas would pull away, breathing hard, reminding them both they had promised to wait. But the waiting was bearable, because they knew it had an end. As December approached, Audrey stood at her window watching the first real snows dust Ravensmere's grounds. 6 weeks ago, she had been rejected and homeless. Now she was preparing to become a duchess. She touched the glass, breath fogging the pain, and smiled. Just 2 more weeks until she could call Thomas her husband. 2 more weeks until Henry would have a father's protection. 2 more weeks until their family became official. She could wait 2 more weeks for forever. December 15th dawned cold and clear. The sky a pale winter blue that promised no more snow. Audrey woke before the household stirred, her heart racing with anticipation and nerves intertwined. Today she would marry Thomas. Today she would become the Duchess of Westmarch. Today everything would change, officially and irrevocably. Mary arrived with breakfast and helped her bathe, the water scented with lavender to calm her trembling hands. Mrs. Whitmore appeared an hour later, carrying a gown that made Audrey's breath catch. It was ivory silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline, elegant in its simplicity. Not Charlotte's dress, but something new, something made specifically for her. Thomas had commissioned it weeks ago, working with a seamstress from York who had taken Audrey's measurements in secret. "He wanted you to have something that was yours alone," Mrs. Whitmore said softly, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Something with no ghosts attached." Audrey touched the fabric with reverent fingers. "It is beautiful." "As are you, child." Mrs. Whitmore's voice cracked slightly. "You have brought light back to this house. Do not doubt for a moment that you belong here." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Her hair was arranged with winter roses, pale pink against dark curls. She wore the sapphire ring Thomas had given her on a chain around her neck until it could be joined by a wedding band. Henry, dressed in his finest clothes, gurgled happily in Mary's arms, oblivious to the significance of the day. At noon, the chapel bells began to ring. The chapel at Ravensmere was small and ancient, stone walls holding centuries of prayers and promises. Winter sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the floor in jewel tones. The pews were filled with villagers, tenants and servants, all those who had come to love Audrey during her months at Ravensmere. Even some of the county families had come, curiosity or genuine goodwill bringing them despite the scandal. Thomas stood at the altar in formal black, his face solemn until he saw her. Then his expression transformed, softening into something that made her chest ache with its tenderness. Beside him stood the vicar, and in the front pew, Mrs. Whitmore held Henry, the baby clutching a small pillow with 2 gold rings sewn to its surface. Audrey walked down the aisle alone, no father or brother to give her away, but she did not feel alone. She felt every eye upon her, felt the weight of acceptance from those who had learned to see past scandal to the woman beneath. When she reached Thomas, he took her hand and his fingers trembled against hers. "You are breathtaking," he whispered. "As are you." The ceremony began. The vicar spoke of love and duty, of commitment and faith. Audrey heard the words through a haze of emotion, aware only of Thomas's hand in hers, his eyes never leaving her face. When it came time for vows, his voice rang clear and strong. "I, Thomas Edward Ellsworth, take you, Audrey Margaret Ashford, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Her own voice shook but held steady as she repeated the sacred words, binding herself to him before God and witnesses. When Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, his thumb lingered on her knuckle, that familiar gesture of comfort and promise. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar declared. "Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Thomas cupped her face in both hands and kissed her softly, reverently, mindful of their audience, but unable to hide the emotion behind the gesture. When they parted, his eyes glistened. "My Duchess," he murmured. "My love." The chapel erupted in applause. Henry chose that moment to let out a delighted shriek, and laughter rippled through the assembled crowd. Thomas retrieved his son from Mrs. Whitmore, holding the baby against his chest as he offered Audrey his other arm. They walked out together into the cold December afternoon, a family now in every sense that mattered. The villagers threw winter flowers, and somewhere someone began to sing. The celebration continued in Ravensmere's great hall, tables laden with food, music filling the air with joy. Audrey danced with Thomas, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization as they had at the ball weeks ago. But this time there was no scandal, no whispered judgment. There was only happiness, celebration, the beginning of something beautiful and hard-won. As evening fell and guests began to depart, Thomas found Audrey in the conservatory, a glass room filled with winter-blooming plants that Mrs. Whitmore tended with care. She stood looking out at the snow-dusted gardens, Henry asleep against her shoulder. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around both mother and child. His chin rested on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. "Happy, my love. Happier than I ever imagined possible." They stood like that for a long moment, watching darkness deepen beyond the glass. Then Thomas spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw you in that square, I thought I was offering you shelter. I did not know you would offer me salvation." Audrey turned in his arms, careful not to wake Henry. "Thomas, you saved us." "No." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You saved me. You reminded me that life continues after loss, that joy can return when we least expect it, that love is not a finite resource, but something that grows stronger when shared." A sharp cry interrupted them. Henry had woken, his small face scrunching in displeasure at being jostled. Thomas took him gently, lifting the baby to his shoulder and patting his back with practiced ease. "There now, little one. All is well. Your mother and I are simply being foolish and sentimental." Audrey watched Thomas soothe their son, her heart so full it felt close to bursting. This man who had lost everything had opened his heart to love again, to accept not just her, but Henry as well, giving them both his name and protection without hesitation. The months that followed brought their own challenges. Some families continued to whisper about the hasty marriage and the bastard child raised as a duke's son. But most came to accept what they could not change, and time softened even the harshest judgments. Audrey threw herself into managing Ravensmere's charity work, establishing a program to help unwed mothers and widows, giving them the support she herself had desperately needed. The village school thrived under her continued involvement, and parents who had once questioned her presence now praised her dedication. Thomas watched his wife flourish with quiet pride. She brought warmth to rooms that had been cold too long, laughter to halls that had echoed with silence. She made Ravensmere feel like a home again, rather than a mausoleum of grief. Henry grew into a bright, cheerful child who called Thomas father and never knew he had been anything other than wanted and loved. On his second birthday, Thomas formally adopted him, ensuring that no one could ever question Henry's place in the family or his inheritance rights. And on a spring evening 2 years after their wedding, as apple blossoms drifted through the orchard like snow, Audrey stood on the terrace with Thomas's arms around her, his hand resting gently on her swollen belly where their second child grew. "Another blessing," he murmured against her hair. "Another miracle." She turned in his embrace and kissed him, tasting joy and gratitude and a love that had grown deeper with time. In the garden below, Henry played with a wooden horse Thomas had carved, his laughter carrying on the warm breeze. "Do you remember that night in the square?" she asked softly, "when you offered me shelter? Every moment. How could I forget the night my life began again? I was so frightened, so certain I had nothing left to lose, and now I have everything." She touched his face, tracing the lines that time and laughter had etched around his eyes. "A home, a family, a love I never dared hope for. You gave me all of this." "No, Audrey." Thomas pressed his forehead to hers, his grey eyes holding her gaze with unwavering devotion. "We gave this to each other, two broken people who found wholeness in unlikely places, two souls who refused to surrender to despair. That is what we built together." As the sun set over Ravensmere, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Duke and Duchess of Westmarch stood together, surrounded by the life they had created from courage and compassion and an unexpected love that had bloomed in the cold of winter and flourished into eternal spring. And in that moment, wrapped in warmth and belonging, Audrey finally understood what Thomas had promised her that first night. You have a home now. Not just shelter, not just walls and roof, but home in its truest sense. A place where she was known, valued, and loved beyond measure. A place where she belonged. Forever. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness offered to strangers in their darkest moments. Audrey arrived at Ravensmere with nothing but a baby in her arms and dignity in her spine. She left that cold square with something far more precious: hope. And Thomas, a man who believed his heart had been buried with his first wife, discovered that love does not replace what was lost, but builds something new from the courage to try again. Their story reminds us that family is not always born from blood, but can be chosen, nurtured, and fiercely protected. That scandal and judgment fade when faced with unwavering commitment. That home is not a place, but the people who see us, truly see us, and love us anyway. In the end, perhaps we all need someone to stand beside us when the world tries to make us small. Someone to say, "You are worthy, you are enough, you belong." What would you risk for a love that transforms everything? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to help others discover it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, redemption, and unexpected love. And let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Your presence here matters. Thank you for walking this journey with Audrey and Thomas. May you find your own Ravensmere, your own place of belonging, wherever you are.